When I was a kid, my dad traveled a lot for work. Back then, his company was growing exponentially, and my father was sent to oversee the opening of new stores all across the country. In 2002, he had a particularly busy year. My dad was assigned to a store in Pennsylvania, and because it was a longer assignment, and because it was summertime as well, he decided to take my mom and I with him. Since we were going to be there for 2 months, they gave us a fully furnished house in the suburbs. It was 2 stories tall and at the end of a very lonely cul-de-sac. The town itself was very small, with a little over 3,000 residents, and the suburb where we stayed was even more rural. Our neighborhood was relatively new, and most of the houses were still empty. The housing development, Lone Wood, had only just started cutting into the dense forest that surrounded it, and all the empty houses gave it a very eerie, albeit boring feel. Lucky for me, there were a few other kids who lived in Lone Wood, and one of them happened to be my age. Jamie and I were both 12, and really, that was all we needed to have in common. We had a lot of fun that summer. Being a city kid, I was eager to explore all the bike trails local kids had made out in the woods. The city of Middlesbrough was a very old town, which was incorporated sometime in the early 1800s. The town had tons of history, but nothing really to do. One particularly boring Sunday, Jamie and I even went to the town's museum. It was pretty boring, as expected, until we heard some kid ask an employee about the lost town. The employee replied that it was just a legend, but that was enough to pique my curiosity. I quizzed Jamie about it, but he didn't seem to know much either. It was a full 5 weeks into the summer before I finally got my questions answered. Jamie and I were building a bike ramp over a narrow stream late one afternoon when we saw a group of 5 teenagers boisterously heading out into the woods. They were carrying flashlights and beer, several of them trying to scare the girls of the group into turning back. I wonder where they're going, I mused as I glanced over at Jamie. He stood up and wiped his brow.
I know where they're going.
Where? I stood up and dusted the dirt off my shorts. The novelty of living in a small town had weeks ago given way to boredom, and I jumped on anything that sounded remotely interesting.
They're going to the lost town.
He sighed regretfully. Okay, seriously, what is that? I knew you know more than you let on. I need to know, Jamie. I need to know. I shook his shoulders in mock hysteria, and he stumbled for balance.
All right, I'll tell you. Jeez, Katie.
Jamie picked up his bike and started walking down the bike path. I grabbed mine and followed him.
The lost town is just a dumb legend. The stories say that Middlesbrough used to have a sister city nearby, somewhere in the woods. Then, one day, like a century and a half ago, the whole town just disappeared. The people left or died. Nobody knows. Nobody even remembers the name of the town. It's like a rite of passage or something for kids to go looking for it.
Jeannie, we should—
No!
He stopped and turned to look at me.
Some kid went looking for it in the 70s and never came back. They found his body like 10 years later in the middle of nowhere. He got lost in there. It's easy to do. Everything looks the same.
He was a total idiot. Probably on drugs. It was the 70s. We are a totally different generation. We have sat-nav.
Sat-nav?
He looked at me curiously. Jamie had lived in this town his whole life, and sometimes I forgot how sheltered he was. Satellite navigation? My dad has a GPS that he totally wouldn't notice missing for a day. Come on, Jamie, it'll be so much fun!
I better get back.
Jamie looked at his watch and then mounted his bike.
My dad is taking me to a movie tonight.
We rode in uncomfortable silence until an idea struck me as we rolled over the abandoned train tracks. They were old and almost buried by plant growth. Hey, I know you don't want to talk about it, but has anyone ever found anything?
No. Well, my friend's older brother said he found some human bones in there once, but nobody believed him.
Oh, and where did people look?
Well, almost everyone goes to the lake.
He pointed to the left of us, where we'd seen the teenagers heading earlier.
It's pretty deep back there, but they figure that if there was another town, they would have lived by the lake. So that's where they go.
Well, you know what I would do? I would follow the train tracks. I mean, they look pretty old, and I don't know why they would lay them going back into those woods unless there was something back there. So that's where I'd go.
Yeah, I could buy that. No one follows the tracks that way, though. That's where the kid that disappeared went.
I wasn't swayed. I didn't bring up the lost town again until 2 weeks later. It was the weekend before we were moving home, and my parents had a barbecue for the employees of Dad's new store and some of our neighbors. Jamie and I hung out inside the house and played my N64 while we flirted pretty outrageously. There had been an unspoken sort of mutual attraction throughout the summer that no one had had the guts to act on. Since I was moving home in 5 days, there really was nothing left to lose. Although his intentions were probably pure and genuine, I am embarrassed to say that mine were not. I thought that if I could make him want to impress me, he would agree to go looking for the lost town. The legend had thoroughly consumed me. I had been to the local library every morning for the past week looking for some information on the town, and had found nothing. But legends don't just come from nowhere. I was sure of it. I knew if we didn't leave by 2 p.m., we wouldn't have enough daylight to carry out my plan. I already had a backpack packed with water, a flashlight, a camera, and a can of red spray paint. I figured if we left the tracks, we would need a way to find our way back to them. I thought I was so clever. Nothing in that backpack made a damn bit of difference in the end. I was a fool. I set my controller down and turned to look at Jamie. So, do you want to go out in the woods one last time? I raised my eyebrow at him and smiled.
Yeah,
he said excitedly, and he jumped off the couch. Then, embarrassed, he cast his eyes down on the floor.
Yeah, you know, if you want to, that's cool.
Cool, let's go! I grabbed his hand and ran out the front door, grabbing my strategically placed backpack on the way. Jamie didn't even notice it. He was walking faster than I was. When we had gotten a decent way into the trees, Jamie turned around and looked briefly at my face before casting his eyes to the ground. He rubbed at the back of his neck.
I've actually, wanted to kiss you all summer.
I was stunned into silence, absolutely dumbfounded that Jamie had found the guts to say anything like this. I knew I needed to fill the awkward silence left in his wake, so I did the only thing I could think of. I leaned in and kissed him. It was the awkward first kiss of two 12-year-olds, but it made me feel warm and sent a flight of butterflies swirling into my stomach. So I actually really did like Jamie. How about that? I let him go, and his face was the same shade of red that I imagined mine was. He quickly changed the subject for how long he wanted to ask me out, but that he didn't think I liked him back. We walked for a while, carrying on this conversation, him oblivious to his surroundings, me subtly leading the way. It took him stumbling over the tracks to break off his monologue and finally notice the backpack. He looked at me like I'd punched him in the face.
You can't be serious!
Jamie, I know, but look, this is the last time I'm gonna see you in a really long time, and I want to remember today. We will only be out for 2 hours max. We'll be back before they even realize we're gone. Jamie stared at the tracks for a minute and seemed to be considering it all. I held my breath until he finally let out a deep sigh.
Okay.
Oh my god, Jamie, He held up his finger, cutting me off.
But we follow the tracks the entire time and we turn around after an hour.
Okay! I was so excited that I hugged him. It would be the first and last time I ever did. As we walked, we talked about all sorts of mundane things, stopping only to make sure we were still on the tracks. It felt like we had only been walking for 45 minutes, but when Jamie checked his watch, it had been 3 hours.
That's weird. It hasn't been 3 hours. It says it's 5 o'clock.
I swear, we left just after 2. It can't be 5, dude. Your watch is busted. I gave him a playful shove. Jamie raised his eyebrow at me and smiled.
Even so, we should probably turn around.
He wasn't wrong. The sun was setting. The shadows were long, and looking around, I wondered if it really was 5 o'clock. But I wasn't ready to give up just yet. As we had been walking, I'd noticed something taking shape off to our right. A large mass, maybe a quarter-mile away. It was denser than the area around it, and seemed to have clean, man-made lines. "Jamie, look!" He turned.
Yeah, I was hoping you hadn't noticed it. It's a long way off, though. We would never find the tracks again.
Yes, we would. Check it out! I triumphantly pulled the spray paint out of my backpack. It's for the trees. He took the can and shook it, then made an experimental X on a nearby tree.
Okay, but I get to do the spraying.
I didn't argue. The closer we got to the mass, the more it took shape. First, we could tell it was a building. Then we could tell it was a church. By the time we got to the front door, we were looking at a very old and dilapidated chapel. Remembering my camera, I took a picture of the wooden plaque over the door. Whatever had been written on it had long ago worn away. We walked around the church in awe. The building was small, maybe 500 square feet. The windows were, surprisingly, all intact, but were so caked with dirt and grime that we couldn't see anything inside. "How do we get in?" I asked quietly.
I don't know, but we're going to figure it out. Wait until my brother hears about this. I mean, look at this place.
His excitement was contagious. The front door had a pull handle, but try as we might, we couldn't seem to open the door. "Do you think it's locked?" I asked, as I watched Jamie struggle with it.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, there must be. There was a door around back, though.
The door at the back was a lot more sympathetic and let us in with relative ease. We were standing in a small room with an old wooden desk attached to a wall. There was a small fireplace and old portraits hung up around the tiny office. The people in the pictures were all standing in front of the same maroon background and were looking down at us disapprovingly. Books were scattered everywhere, most in a language I'd never seen before. The floor was covered in dirt, and a pair of old shoes were laying haphazardly in one corner. "Whoa!"
Yeah. Whoa.
I looked over at Jamie, who had a huge smile on his face. He was holding up a cross and a piece of paper. "What is it?" I walked over to see.
It's a list of names. There's like 60 people on this list. Maybe a town census?
"Let me see." I pulled my flashlight out of my backpack and shined it down on the parchment. "Deepwood. Do you think that's the name of the town? All these names are crossed out. All except this one." I pointed to a name at the very bottom.
Maybe it was the plague.
"You think it's a list of the dead?" Jamie shrugged.
Makes as much sense as anything else.
I walked over to the desk and leaned against it. "Why do you think they left? I mean, look, there's a jacket or something on that chair, and shoes over there. The town pastor, or whatever, he just took off and left everything like this?"
Or died,
said Jamie, as he folded the paper and put it into the backpack. "Yeah, died. Either way, it must have been creepy as hell to be alone in here." I stared at one of the portraits for several long seconds. The young woman painted there seemed to be staring down at me with a very accusatory look. It made me incredibly uncomfortable. I was so absorbed in the paintings that I didn't notice the slow creaking from overhead until the ceiling cracked loudly as it started to cave in. I screamed and covered my head, but the next thing I knew, I was laying on my back over the threshold of a door, Jamie on top of me, protecting his head. Thanks," I mumbled as I gently pushed Jamie off of me.
Don't mention it.
Jamie climbed to his feet and brushed himself off. I glanced behind him at the office, which was now filled floor to ceiling with decaying debris. "Jamie, that was our way out."
That's okay. We can unlock the front door now that we're inside. Or break the windows.
If the back office was unsettling, the chapel was downright disturbing. Even though the grimy windows allowed very little sunlight in, I could make out 8 rows of pews lining a narrow aisle and a tall podium at the front of the chapel. Jamie and I stumbled around the small nave, breaking windows on either side with pieces of wood we'd found. The sun was still setting, and I wondered how much of a difference the muted light would make. When I broke the last window on my side, I turned back around to survey the chapel, disappointed that the lighting wasn't much better. The room itself seemed to repel light. The wooden pews were completely rotted. In fact, the wood we had used to break the windows of the church were leg stands from the front row. The narrow aisle in between the rows of pews was littered with leaves and rotting wood. But that was nothing. Nothing compared to what sat upon the altar. It wasn't a podium, as I had thought earlier. It was a statue of the Crucifixion, but unlike any I had ever seen before. The paint had been worn away on every part of the statue, except the blood of the crucifixion wounds, which stood bright and realistic and seemed to be oozing before our very eyes. The only other surface left untouched by the decay of time was the face of Jesus. The details of his face were still so incredibly minute and perfect, and he had the same accusing eyes as the portraits in the pastor's office. He seemed to be staring directly at me, and I could tell Jamie felt the same, though he was across the room from me. The statue's stare awarded me an edge of panic, and I suddenly realized that we needed to leave. We weren't wanted here. I had the sudden feeling that we were trespassing on some sort of hallowed ground. We had found the church, we had documents proving we had been here, and now it was time to go. I turned to Jamie to tell him so, and could immediately tell that he did not share my feelings. He had been born and bred on these legends, and nothing was going to tear him away from our discovery. I watched him walk over to grab a camera out of my bag. He took pictures of everything he deemed interesting, including the crucifixion statue, much to my unease. I gave him several minutes before I said something.
"Jamie, I think we need to leave,"
I said in a low voice. Jamie stopped and looked up, seeming to remember I was there.
Are you kidding? This is what you came for. You have to bring home evidence. All of it.
"It's gonna be dark in half an hour. It's already hard to see in here."
Duh, that's why I'm using a flash. Hey, can you get a picture of me next to the creepy Jesus thing?
I guess,"
I mumbled as I took the camera from him. I didn't even want to look at it, much less photograph it, but if it would help me get him out of here, I was going to stomach it. Jamie wrapped his arm around it just as I snapped the picture.
"Don't touch it!" Oh, crap, why did you touch it? There's something off about that thing, Jamie. Can we freaking go now?
Yeah, fine.
Jamie walked over and picked up the backpack as I headed toward the front door. I noticed there was no lock on it. I pushed against the door as hard as I could. It didn't budge. My heart sank. There wasn't even a handle or a knob. It was just a solid piece of wood with strange markings on it, symbols I had never seen before.
"Jamie, the door is stuck,"
I said, as I turned around to see him testing a piece of the floor with his foot.
"What are you doing?"
I asked, hearing the edge of panic in my voice. He was still at the front of the chapel, a foot from the Jesus statue, hopping back and forth from one part of the floor to another. The statue's eyes seemed to be only on him now.
There's something under here. See?
I heard the floorboard creak under his left foot as he put weight on it.
"Jamie, don't."
No, it's like under the dirt, right here. The floor is hollow.
He kneeled down and started digging through the thin layer of dirt.
It's a trap door or something.
And it was indeed a trap door. By the time I had walked the edge of the pews, Jamie already had the edges dug halfway out.
Let's just leave it, and your brother and his friends can come back and see what it is. Please, Jamie, I want to go.
There was something wrong about this place, terribly wrong, and the thought of spending one more minute here had me on the precipice of a panic attack, something I hadn't experienced in over a year. I sat down against the front pew and put my head down. I heard a roaring in my ears, and my breathing grew labored. I had to leave here, even without Jamie. I rocked back and forth for a few minutes as I tried to calm myself down. I would climb out of a window and run. Any direction, it didn't matter.
There's something here under the church.
Jamie's voice sounded a million miles away. By the time I pulled myself together enough to lift my head, Jamie was knelt next to me.
I didn't know you were claustrophobic.
At least, that's what I think, Jamie said. I better remember the horror I felt as I stared at the hole in the floor. Jamie had opened the trapdoor.
2 minutes,
Jamie said as he stood up.
We go down, we take a couple of pictures of whatever's down there, and we come right back up and we leave. Just 2 minutes, Katie. That's all I'm asking.
I wanted to say no. I intended to, but I felt myself slowly nodding as Jamie pulled me to my feet. To this day, I don't understand why I agreed, but I suppose that it's better than what happened down there didn't happen to Jamie alone.
We're going to come back with the story of a lifetime. What if there's valuable stuff or something down there? Old shit is always worth money. We could be rich. So rich that your family could stay here. You could buy the house you're living in and come to school with me in September.
I managed a small smile. Of all the things someone could think to buy with wealth, Jamie's first thought was to keep me here with him. And he was right. There could be anything down there, and almost all old stuff was valuable. I took a deep breath.
Okay, 2 minutes.
As we leaned over the trapdoor and peered down, the first thing we noticed was an intense heat emanating upward from the hole. The second was the strangely out-of-place spiral staircase leading into the depths below. Jamie rolled the flashlight over to me with his foot, and I picked it up as he pulled his lighter out of his pocket.
Ladies first.
He smirked at me. I stared at him, slack-jawed.
No way! You found this door, you go first. Between the black staircase and the heat, I feel like we're descending directly into hell. I am not going first!
I crossed my arms and glared at him to reinforce my point. Jamie simply shrugged and stepped onto the staircase. I took several deep breaths as I watched his head disappear into the darkness below. I almost didn't follow him. I was still deciding when he yelled at me to shine the flashlight down the stairs so he could see. I stared down the stairs after him. They went down much further than I thought, and it became warmer and warmer the further down we went. When we finally reached the bottom, I was holding back what threatened to be a massive anxiety attack. We were farther beneath the church than I'd thought we'd be, and it was hot, muggy, and difficult to breathe. Hoping to get this over with as fast as possible, I swung the flashlight around the chamber, hoping to reveal its hidden treasure. What I saw there, I can never describe, though I have tried many times. The room was entirely empty, save 2 things. One was a desk in the corner, much like the one in the pastor's office. The second was another statue. This one was roughly 12 feet tall and remains to this day the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. To put it mildly, it was some sort of demon. It towered over us, and as such I could only see the bottom of its jaw from where I was. It was looking directly ahead of it, at the staircase we had just ascended. Its tail was long and swept around the entire room. There wasn't a lot of room to move. It had claws, like any modern depiction of a demon, and as I moved around the chamber to view its profile, I noticed it had horns as well. Neither Jamie nor I spoke as we shuffled around the room, our backs to the wall, as far away from the demon as physically possible. I stepped carefully over the tail as I made my way to its back and came around to the other side of the statue. I couldn't take my eyes from it. I couldn't trust it. If the statue upstairs seemed to bleed, what could this one do? As I eyed the talons on the gigantic stone feet, Jamie broke the silence.
Can you even believe this shit?
His voice was coming from the other side of the room. I searched the darkness for the weak glow of his lighter and was relieved to see it moving toward me. I turned my flashlight upward to shine it on the side of the demon's head. The horns had to be at least a foot tall. As I brought it down to see where Jamie was, I hit my arm on something hard.
Ow! My head!
Jamie squeaked as my flashlight fell to the ground and rolled under the desk.
God damn it, Jamie!
I whispered in a panic. I dropped to my knees and felt around under the desk, searching for the flashlight.
What? It's not my fault you cracked me on the head.
I stood back up and swung the light around to see Jamie trying to relight his lighter. But it wasn't him that stopped me dead. I will forever be frozen in that moment. I don't know why I couldn't speak, couldn't scream, couldn't move. All I could feel was my own descent into madness. As I had moved the beam of light up to Jamie's face, I had seen another face right next to his. A twisted, angry, soulless face. The demon's. The statue had bent down and turned to the side, its head mere inches from Jamie's. And it was staring at me. I cannot describe its face, and I am not sure my mind will ever let me remember it in detail. It shook me to my core in a literal sense. My body was having a dark, violent, visceral reaction to this impossibility. Jamie finally noticed the flashlight shaking in my hand and turned to see what I was looking at.
Ah!
It wasn't until he started screaming that I was shaken from my paralysis. I dropped the flashlight. Jamie dropped everything else, and we ran. We took the stairs 2 and 3 at a time, Jamie pushing me up ahead of him. Halfway up, I slipped, and we both went tumbling down halfway to the bottom. In that horrible moment, we heard the grinding of stone against stone, and we knew the statue was moving. Jamie screamed, but I was mute, too horrified to make a sound. We got up and kept climbing, never taking our eyes off the small, dying light above us, our only salvation now. We were almost to the top when we first heard it on the stairs. It was so large and heavy that the entire staircase shook with the impact. Terrified that the stairs would come crashing down and we would be left alone with it below, we jumped the last 3 steps. Jamie pushed me up out of the opening. He climbed out after me and tried to slam the trapdoor shut, but it was somehow stuck. We could hear a deafening thunder on the staircase as the statue slowly climbed the steps. I helped Jamie try to push the trapdoor closed, and for the first time noticed the symbols on the bottom of the wood, the same as those on the front door. Before I could begin to comprehend this, I noticed the demon first penetrate the shaft of light on the staircase below. It was coming. Jamie saw it too and pulled me to a standing position while pointing at the front door. We both ran at it as hard as we could, but when we hit it, it didn't budge. We tried again, but it was unsympathetic.
Katie, the windows!
We ran to the closest one and tried to climb up the wall to get out, but the windows were too high. The thunder from below was getting louder, closer. It was more than halfway up the stairs. We tried to climb on the rotting pews to reach the windows, but they crumbled under our weight.
I'll push you out. Give me your foot.
Jamie yelled over the sound bellowing from below. I shook my head. I wanted to. God, I wanted to, but I couldn't leave him. I couldn't leave Jamie to face that thing alone. We both looked over at the door again. Our only chance was to keep trying to break it down. We stumbled back into the aisle and ran at the front door with everything we had. I thought I felt it move. We backed up even further and ran at it again. This time the impact knocked me backwards into the aisle, and Jamie barely stayed on his feet. He looked at me in horror, and I turned around to see the stone horns rising up from the darkness of the trapdoor, 3 feet from where I sat. We were going to die here. I stood up, refusing to turn around again. I knew that the next step it took would bring its head into the room, and the thought of seeing its face again had me running at the door with every last bit of strength I had. Jamie reached it at the same time, and I felt it give way as we crashed through the threshold and landed outside the church. Jamie had picked me up off the ground before I could think to move, and we were running toward the train tracks at an Olympic sprint. We could still hear the thundering on the stairs, no matter how far we got from the church. Every step echoed through the woods like a gunshot, until they stopped. It was here. I had no idea if we had run in the right direction or if we would be forever lost in those woods. It was now dark outside and the temperature was dropping fast. I was beginning to panic that we would never find the train tracks when I noticed Jamie wasn't next to me anymore. I turned around in a panic to find him sprawled on the ground a few yards behind me. He had tripped over one of the rails. He was up and running down the tracks before I could even ask if he was okay. We ran until we couldn't anymore. Our running eventually slowed to a jog, and the jog to a walk. We hadn't spoken. Neither of us had any idea what to say. And it wasn't until we had both gotten our breath back that one of us finally broke the silence.
How long have we been on the tracks?
Jamie's voice had an edge of barely suppressed fear. I looked at his wrist and noticed his watch was missing.
It didn't take us this long to find this place. Or did it? Do you think maybe we went the wrong way?
Jamie asked, hesitantly. I couldn't afford to think like that. If we had somehow gotten turned around and ran the wrong way down the train tracks, then we were deeper into the woods than ever. No, we went the right way, I said to convince myself.
That thing. I thought it was a statue, but maybe it was some crazy, undiscovered giant reptile that was hibernating, and we woke it up.
So we were going to delude ourselves into thinking there was a scientific explanation for this. I understood why, but I just couldn't accept it. Yeah, I said slowly. Did you see the weird writing on the front door? It was on the trapdoor, too. Do you think it was keeping it down there? Because, Jamie, all those doors are open now.
Well, if it's an animal, words mean nothing to it anyway.
Yeah, if... I trailed off, hoping he would challenge my implication. He didn't. I could tell this was something Jamie's mind wouldn't accept, but he hadn't seen its face, not like I had. It was no animal. It was made of stone. It was something sinister and anciently evil, and it had seen me, had seen right down into my soul. It was aware of me, and I was aware of it. And now, it was free. Whatever had been keeping it beneath the church had been awkwardly destroyed by Jamie and me. That thing was free to walk the woods and go God knows where. We walked in silence for another half hour, until Jamie suddenly stopped short and started yelling.
Here! We're here!
He booked it down the tracks toward a swarm of flashlights, and I followed close behind him. As soon as Jamie reached his parents, he collapsed, while I ran into my mother's arms and cried like a child. I couldn't hold it together any longer. The police report says we were found at 4 a.m. By our sense of time, around 3 hours after the sun had set. We had spent less than an hour in the chapel, and yet we seemed to have lost 10 hours there. We never told anyone where we had actually been, or that we had found the lost city of Deepwood. We simply said we went for a walk to the lake and got lost in the woods. My family left Middlesbrough the following Monday, 2 days ahead of schedule. My father had another store to open, and there was really no reason to wait. Jamie didn't come to say goodbye to me, and after we left Middlesbrough, I never saw him again. I kept a copy of the police report to remember him. Over the following year, Middlesbrough slowly disappeared. At first, I could just feel the memory fading unnaturally from my mind. My parents couldn't remember that we had ever been there, which scared me more than anything else. I taped the police report to the ceiling over my bed so that Jamie would be the first and last thing I thought about every day. Then, the Middlesbrough city website disappeared, as did that of the local paper and the town's 2 public schools. The store my dad helped open in 2002 also disappeared from the company's website. After that, I could never find any mention of Middlesbrough anywhere online ever again. Over the years, I searched public records for Jamie's full name and found nothing. I hired someone to illegally search private records, and he came up empty too. In the end, the only proof that Jamie ever existed at all was the police report with his name on it. And then, nothing was left. One day, the paper I had taped to my ceiling for so many years was blank. I remember what it was and what it looked like before, but now it's just an old weathered piece of blank paper. All that remains of Middlesbrough and the people who live there are my memories. And this is why I am writing this story down and putting it on the internet. Once it's on the internet, it can never die, right? Or perhaps, one day, it will just disappear, and you won't ever remember seeing it or hearing it. I won't ever remember writing it or recording it. And I can only hope that this ended with Middlesbrough. If it has moved on to other towns, who would know? Who would even remember? I wish I had answers. But all I have are questions. Harrisburg is an antiquated yet charming Pennsylvania town on the Susquehanna River with roots reaching back into the 18th century. At least, that's what the tourism brochure read. I'd really have to take their word for it. I had researched a lot of Pennsylvanian townships in the last year, but this wasn't one of them. I handed the brochure back to the tall, red-faced girl behind the hotel desk. She sniffed loudly as she took it and unceremoniously slid my credit card back across the counter at me. "Thanks," I muttered. The girl dropped a brass key on the counter, which I eyed with suspicion. I hadn't seen a hotel with actual brass keys since I was a kid. I didn't know if it was my limited funds or Harrisburg's antiquated charm at work, but either way, it sent an involuntary shudder down my spine.
"Room 217. Checkout's at 10.
The girl said, wiping her small, watery eyes on the back of her sleeve. I picked up my luggage and shoved off to find my room. Eager to be done with it, I hadn't bothered to ask where to find room 217. When I finally located it on the other side of the building, I was exhausted and ready for whatever awaited me on the other side of the door. It was as you'd suspect, dated, droll, and dusty. I took a short shower and spread my maps out on the painfully flat yet somehow still lumpy hotel mattress. It was strange to be back in Pennsylvania after all these years. Honestly, I was just happy it was still here. I had spent years trying to pretend I dreamed it all, trying to convince myself that I'd had a very vivid psychotic breakdown and I'd never actually been to Pennsylvania at all. And I might have believed it, too. If it weren't for Jamie. He was as real to me as the face in the mirror. I couldn't have dreamed him up if I'd wanted to. And if he had been real, then so had everything else. The damned church, the demon, and the hell I'd brought down on Middlesbrough. How many more had died since then? I needed to see for myself. I needed to prove I wasn't crazy, even if doing it meant I would have to face the consequences of my actions. The death. I stared at my notes and topographical maps until my vision began to blur. I'd been researching and preparing for this trip for a year, and yet here I was in Pennsylvania still with no real direction. It had been 13 years since I'd stepped foot in this state, and only for one of them had I considered coming back. I'd lived only half a life for the last decade, slowly suffocating under the heavy, pungent cloak of guilt. Usually I could escape it in ambient-laced dreams, or when I was utterly blackout drunk, which is an easy order to fill when you work in a bar. But a year ago, my tricks had abruptly stopped working, and it had been too long since I'd come up for air. I'd known it was time to go back. I spent an hour trying to find a comfortable position on the worn-out hotel mattress. When that failed, I picked up the maps again and studied their details, though I'd memorized them all. I suppose I was waiting for something to just click, Some small detail I'd overlooked that would suddenly make all the difference. A clue as clear as daybreak that had been in front of me all along. But none came. And when I woke again, it was buried under a pile of legal pads and maps and suffering a sore back. I showered again, not trusting the comforter, and reluctantly drank the motor oil that passed for breakfast blend coffee. I packed up my research, checked out of the hotel, and sat in my car, watching the sun slowly brighten the populated downtown area. At least the creature hadn't made its way here. This city had a population of around 50,000. But how many other cities with similar populations were gone because of me? It wasn't something I wanted an answer to. Since I had no other data to go on, my plan was to drive to the least populated areas and see if what wasn't there would give me a clue to what had once been. Basically, I was looking for an area that by all logic should have a city, but didn't. I put the Ford Focus in drive and headed west out of the town. Half a day was spent driving to the middle of the state, and another 2 days aimlessly driving around central Pennsylvania, looking for something familiar. A mountain, a water tower, a road, anything. But it was as if I'd never lived here at all. I only had 3 more days before my flight back to Arizona, and so far the trip had been utterly useless. The man at the front desk took my key and gestured toward the continental breakfast of prepackaged muffins and horse-piss coffee. "No thanks," I grumbled.
"Where you headed?"
"Huh?" I raised an eyebrow at him.
"Where you headed?"
he repeated, more slowly. I couldn't place his accent. The closest I could get was maybe Southern? I don't know.
"Well, if you're headed down the 320, gas up before you leave town. There ain't no gas stations or towns between here and Landenberg."
"But that's like 90 miles away."
"Yep. Never understood it myself. People get stuck on that road all the time, blowing tires and running out of gas. I don't know why the government hasn't done something about that."
"Because they're broke,"
someone yelled from the back office.
"Yep, that's it, most likely. The state ain't got no money for it."
"I'll get gas before I go," I promised, and received an approving nod in return. I practically ran out of the door. For days I'd been looking for the out-of-place, the not quite right, the bizarre, and this was... well, it was odd, at least, and it was all I had. I gassed up before I left town and followed the signs to the 320. As promised, it was nothing but dark asphalt for miles. No exits, rest stops, signs, or even mile markers. This was it. It just had to be. Since there was no one else on the road, I drove well under the speed limit, taking in every detail. Eventually, I began to notice that periodically there would be a gap. Not in the foliage, but in the coloring of it. Every so often, a grove of trees would be duller, sicker. It was something you'd only notice if you were looking for it. So the creature, as I'd taken to calling it, could technically give life, in the process of filling in the hole of previous existence. But not very good life. The fauna in these spots was weaker and bore dull, almost muted coloring. I continued noting these spots until I couldn't count them anymore. These had likely been cities or homes of people with lives, families, futures, all taken from them because of me. I felt the panic begin to claim the edges of my vision and quickly popped a Xanax. My panic attacks had become unbearable after Middlesbrough. I suffered from them still. The edges of my vision got hazy and I was able to relax a fraction. At some point, I processed the presence of the dilapidated railroad tracks running parallel to the road. I'd noticed them early on, but my mind had hidden the significance of this until now. They may not have been the tracks, but to me, it was a sign that I was on the right track, so to speak. I was close. I had to be. And if Landenberg was still there, that meant the creature hadn't made it that far yet. I somehow knew, like I knew that I'd once lived somewhere off this road, that the creature had been moving north, but it hadn't claimed Landenberg yet. Why? Was it satiated? Had it left the area? Or was it just slow-moving? Whatever the answer, I felt like I'd learned it in Landenberg. As I reached the outskirts of the city, I saw my first road sign since I'd merged onto the 320. Landenberg. Next 17 exits. I decided to take the exit that would get me into the heart of downtown Lanenburg, if there was one. I hadn't researched the city of Lanenburg either, thinking it was too far north to matter. And yet here I was. The downtown area began to take shape off my right like the damned church had in the woods so long ago. But I didn't need spray paint to find my way anymore. I exited the highway and drove around the cityscape until I found a centrally located hotel that I could afford. I parked and heaved my bags out of the car, hoping they had vacancy. They did. I was told by the overly flirty college senior behind the front desk, slinging his guitar behind his back. "Do you have Wi-Fi?" I asked, as he handed me the keycard.
"We do, but there's a $10 a day charge for the password."
Damn. I was on an extremely tight budget.
"But I can give it to you for free if..."
He let his voice trail off suggestively. "If what?" I raised a skeptical eyebrow at him.
"If you let me write a song about you."
He writed my credit card receipt so he could read it.
"Caitlin?"
I sighed. Okay, yeah, fine. At this point, there wasn't much I'd say no to. I was going on 4 days of restless sleep. He eagerly gave me the password, and I retired to my room. First floor, thankfully. I took out my shitty laptop, connected to the hotel's equally shitty Wi-Fi, and pulled up the Wikipedia page for Lanenburg. It was a larger city for this part of the state, around 55,000 residents, mostly due to the fact that Lanenburg hosted a state university. It was a progressive, young, educated town filled with hipsters and young professionals. Where to even begin? I threw my notes, my phone, and my GPS in my backpack and decided to start with the front desk of the motel, much to my own dread. The college kid who checked me in was strumming chords on his guitar and softly humming. "Excuse me." He looked up at me and winked.
"You're pretty eager, foxy lady, and I like that. But songs take time to write, even for the most talented..."
"Yeah, actually, I was just wondering, where can I find the university?" I interrupted, suppressing an eye roll.
"Mama, this whole city's a campus. I mean, where do you want to go? You a new student? I'll show you around. I get off and..."
"No, I'd like to find the... This had been a horrible mistake. Think of something quick, genius. Admissions office. I need to talk to admissions."
"Oh, well, that's about half a mile down Rooker Street. That's the one..."
"Running in front of the building. Got it. Thanks." He started to say something else, perhaps which way to go down Rooker, but I was already out the door. Not knowing what else to do, and wanting to get as far away from the poor kid as possible, I picked a direction and started walking. Even though it was May, I was still freezing. I hadn't been built for the far north, and my blood had thinned out living in Arizona. With my backpack and my age, I probably would have passed for any other college student on campus, if it wasn't for the hoodie I had pulled tightly around me. I envied them all. Kids just a year or two younger than me, going to classes, hanging out with their friends, making stupid yet amusing mistakes. It could have been me once. But I hadn't grown up like them. Ever since Middlesbrough, I had struggled with school and life in general. I couldn't focus. I couldn't laugh. I became a sarcastic, guilt-ridden introvert, and I lost all my friends. Then my dad died, and my mom started to look at me differently. I stopped talking about Middlesbrough the day I heard the word hospital whispered to my mother by a psychiatrist. Even though I stopped trying to prove it had all been real, my mother never really saw me as her little girl again. I'd moved out at 18 and lived alone for years, working in an English pub, trying to forget how many people were probably dead because of me, including Jamie, the knife that dug the deepest. I walked the downtown area all day. I didn't know what I was doing, where I was going, who I should approach, or what I should ask them. I just knew I was in the right place. I'd been drawn here for a reason. I felt it in my gut. This was where I was supposed to be. But for the 5th time in as many days, I had to ask myself, what now? I suppose I could have spent days wandering around Lanenburg. I could have left empty-handed and never known what happened all those years ago. I could have never found him. But as fate would have it, it only took half a day to find out what I was looking for. It was well past noon, and I had stopped at a small cafe to eat a sandwich. Since the restaurant was packed wall-to-wall with students, I went outside and leaned against the brick wall by the door. I suppose I noticed it because it was so brightly colored. Or maybe because it was the only piece of litter I'd seen all morning. Or maybe it was simply because I was supposed to. But for whatever reason, when a bright red flyer blew past my feet, I reached out to step on it. Curious, I bent down to pick it up and read the heading. Tathan History Museum, Lanenburg, PA. Upcoming exhibitions. 13th to 14th century Judeo-Christian relics and artifacts. Below that was a blurb about the museum. Nothing too interesting. And below that was a description of the exhibits to be unveiled. I skimmed down the list quickly, seeing little of interest. Until the very bottom. Statue of the demon Metaraxes. My mouth fell open. It was too much of a coincidence. Nothing to be ignored. I checked the date on the flyer. May 2nd, 2014. 3 weeks ago. I threw the rest of my sandwich in the trash and took off. I'd seen the museum that morning and I knew exactly where to find it. It was only 3 blocks away and I got there in under 5 minutes, flew up the building steps, and stumbled straight to the cashier window.
Student ID, please.
The old man said flatly. I'm not a student.
Well, your look.
How much?
$11.
I was gladly willing to pay. I didn't stop to grab a map, instead joining a tour group already in progress. The museum, I could tell, was a veritable labyrinth, and I certainly didn't want to get lost. Not in here, not with that thing, if indeed it really was what I half hoped, half dreaded it could be. It took the longest 20 minutes of my life, but we finally came to the room I'd been waiting for.
Now behind this door is our newest exhibition on ancient Judeo-Christian artifacts. Please do not try to touch anything, or you will be escorted out. These pieces are centuries old and may be damaged by the lightest touch.
If you have behind that door what I suspect you do, then I highly doubt it.
Also, please no flash photography.
My heart beat 1,000,000 miles a minute as the docent opened the double doors and my group was shuffled in. I lingered toward the back, letting everyone go in front of me. I had come thousands of miles and done months of research to find that statue, to prove I wasn't insane. Yet when the time came to possibly face my nightmare, I was hesitant. Finally, I was the last, and the docent had to wave me in with a polite but impatient hand. There were about 100 things in that room. All sorts of things, really. Sculptures, paintings, pottery, even other statues. But I only had eyes for the thing in the middle. It was larger than I remembered. Not the 12 feet I had guessed. It was actually closer to 20. But every detail of its face and body was exactly as I'd remembered, though it was positioned differently now. In the church all those years ago, it had seemed as if it was standing, waiting yet content. But now it was positioned as if ready to leap off the stone square that it stood upon. Its tail was paused in midair, instead of wrapped idly around its legs as it had been before. Though it was taller than I'd remembered, I could at least see its face this time. It wasn't particularly scary, just an empty, stony face, far from the hungry, animated one it became when it woke. And like the crucifixion statue in the damned church, it had eyes only for me. The rest of my group took photos, oohing and eyeing as they made their way around the room. I stood directly where I was, against the now-closed door, going no further. The docent walked around the room, discussing the notable pieces of the collection, and I only moved from the door when she finally stood before the creature.
And finally, the jewel of this exhibition, a granite statue from the 14th century. This is a representation of Metaraxes, a lesser-known demon of Christian mythology. It is unique in its size as well as its crisp detail, especially for something so old. Our conservationists are unable to discover its place of origin or creator.
I edged closer and closer to the red velvet rope. Its eyes followed my every step. The room seemed to grow hotter. The docent moved to the side so people could get pictures in front of the statue. Though I couldn't blame them, I barely kept from yelling. This was madness. The stone platform on which the demon stood was covered in red velvet, which pulled at the creature's feet. It hid the words inscribed on the front of the granite stand that Jamie and I couldn't read those many years ago. The docent droned on about nothing, and I read the description plaque. 14th century representation of the demon Metaraxes. Artist unknown. And then I saw what I didn't know I'd been looking for. The triangles. The symbols I would never forget, etched into the doors of the damned church. And once I found one, I found another and another. There were half a dozen of them. So that's how they're doing it. They, whoever they were, had placed wards all around the base of the creature's stand. The museum not only knew what this thing was, they knew about the sigils on the doors of the damned church and were using them to trap the statue here. The revelation was like a punch to the face. Someone was aware of what this statue really was and was blatantly risking innocent lives anyway. It was insane. In a panic, I turned to find the docent and saw her conversing politely with an elderly couple. "Excuse me," I interrupted loudly.
Yes?
She failed to mask her irritation at my rudeness. "Where did the museum acquire this statue?"
This piece is on loan from a private collection.
"Whose?"
It belongs to Jameson Scott.
The docent, feeling the exchange was over, turned back to finish her conversation. Jameson Scott. I knew that name, but from where? As our group began to move out of the room, I took one last look at the creature, Metaraxes, and shuddered. Its eyes had never strayed from me. I took my phone out and pulled up a Wikipedia page on Jameson Scott. I had to know who could be this stupid. He was young, my age, but wealthy, had his own company and well known in the tech industry for multiple inventions. The words brilliant, pioneer, and industry leader were scattered throughout his Wikipedia page, which had no picture. At the end of the article, under personal life, was a short paragraph about his interest in symbolism and ancient artifacts. I shook my head as my group was herded into the museum's gift shop. What did he want with the statue? How had he acquired it? And how did he know about the wards? None of it made sense. I wandered through the gift shop, idly picking up trinkets and wondering just what to do. Should I warn the docent? The curator? Or did this Scott person know what he was doing? Were the wards enough? Somehow I didn't think so.
Are you going to the lecture tonight?
Someone asked from behind me. I swung around, my backpack nearly taking out a postcard stand as I did.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were someone else.
The redheaded girl turned to leave. What lecture? I asked before she could get away.
The lecture our guide was talking about?
I stared at her blankly.
Jameson Scott's lecture on the exhibit?
He's in town?
Yeah, that's what she said.
The girl said flippantly.
You should go. He's really hot.
She turned to leave. Wait, where's the lecture again?
The auditorium in the history building. Building E,
she said, as if I should have known. And I guess she wasn't wrong. I was only a few years older than her, and I looked like a college student. Apparently everyone thought so. Thanks, I yelled after her as she walked off with her giggling friend. I would definitely be there. I had a few things to say to this guy, and I wasn't leaving Pennsylvania until I did. I sat in the back of the auditorium, as was my custom. The room was filled wall to wall with people, faculty and students alike. An empty podium sat in front, and a tall, blonde-haired security guard stood to its left. He had a gun on his hip, and his hands were folded behind his back. Maybe he wasn't a security guard after all. I was pretty sure state campuses were gun-free, which meant he was with somebody important. Jameson Scott, no doubt. The guard stared straight ahead, his eyes boring a hole into the wall behind me. Lots of things about him made me uneasy. The murmurs and whispers died down a moment later when a thin, attractive man walked purposefully onto the stage.
Good evening,
he began. He graced the room with a smile that couldn't fool me. The emotion didn't quite reach his eyes. If anything, he looked like the most stressed-out and tired 25-year-old I'd ever seen.
My name is Jameson Scott. I'm here to speak to you tonight about a few ancient and interesting items I've collected over the years. I'm sorry, but I will not be answering questions about my company, our newest patents, or my personal charities.
I rolled my eyes. Easy, Christian Grey. There were a few disappointed groans from the audience, but Jameson Scott smiled and directed a flirtatious wink at no one in particular. He was an alarmingly charming man.
I have been interested in ancient relics, particularly those of religious significance, for many years. Since I was quite young, actually. A somewhat traumatic experience played the catalyst, and I've been studying and collecting ever since. I'll begin with some of my more well-known pieces, and then move on to the more exotic.
Scott began his lecture on a bowl from Mesopotamia that was supposed to bestow on the user unnaturally long life, as long as you drank from it only water siphoned from the bottom of the Euphrates River. He spoke extensively on several other equally uninteresting artifacts, before finally coming to the only one I cared about, the statue.
Please study this photo for a minute.
Scott clicked to the next slide in his slideshow, and the demon statue appeared against a blood-red background, as imposing and terrifying as it was in real life. A blanket of heavy, uncomfortable air descended on the room as people averted their eyes from the screen and mumbled uncertainly. I didn't take my eyes off it.
This is the piece I spent most of my life trying to locate. May I introduce to you the demon Metaraxes.
He paused for a minute and clicked to the next slide, a Dante-esque depiction of hell.
Metaraxes belongs to the second hierarchy of demons, though he is virtually unknown. And this is simply because of his nature. Metaraxes doesn't kill or possess. He doesn't vie for power, bring darkness into the hearts of men, or try to influence innocence. Metaraxes eats. But he eats more than the flesh of man. He eats their homes, their histories, and their souls. If you were to be eaten by Metaraxes, it would be as if you'd never existed at all. No one would remember you, and now the empty piece of life you had carved out for yourself in the world would fill in as if you were never there. Everything that was you, or ever would be you, is gone.
Jameson Scott paused artfully to let his words wash over the audience, every soul in the room hanging on his every syllable. I suppose it really was quite interesting if you didn't know the heartbreaking truth of it, which I knew he did. For someone hailed as a genius, it seemed utterly reckless of him to romanticize all this. I crossed my arms and slumped lower in my chair. When this was over, one way or another, Jameson Scott and I would be having a conversation.
And this is why Metaraxes is an unknown. There is no one to speak his name or his deeds, alive or dead. Or there wasn't for many centuries. At some point in history, Metaraxes grew tired of being unknown and unworshipped. He proclaimed that those who prayed to him and brought him sacrifice would not only be spared, but also given gifts of everlasting youth and resilience, that which he had stolen from others. It is believed that several ancient civilizations took him up on this offer. They sang his songs, built his temples, and created beautiful artwork in his likeness, such as the one in your museum, to praise the demon and reap his gifts. And this would have gone on for many years, until a name was called that refused to be sacrificed. Metaraxes chose his tributes selectively, but eventually a name would come up of someone rich or in power, and that person would maneuver out of it, or simply commit suicide. In these instances, Metaraxes would grow angry, and eat the city and all the people therein, leaving no trace that he, or they, had ever existed. This would have happened many times over the centuries.
Now this was interesting. The creature could be tamed like a pet. As long as you gave it the trait it wanted, you would not only be saved, but rewarded.
Something else to consider is that no one ever knew how often Metaraxes called a name. Since the person would be absorbed by the demon, no one would ever remember they had existed at all. It could have been one person a year, or 5 a day, and no one would know but the demon himself. You will find mentions of Metaraxes scattered in religious texts dating back as far as 1700 BC, but this statue is rare in that it is the only known likeness of him ever to be found.
Jameson graced the many hand in the air with another tired smile and said,
I'm sorry, but no questions tonight. If you haven't yet had a chance to see the statue of Metaraxes, I encourage you to experience it before it is shipped to New York next month.
Then, without any ceremony at all, Jameson Scott simply walked off the stage, and the lecture was over. His security guard, who I realized was more likely a bodyguard, stepped forward to block several girls who jumped the stage to follow his boss. With him busy, I knew I had a chance. As the throng of people pressed forward to the upper exits, I fell back and went out the rear. I sprinted out of the building and rounded the corner, hoping to see what I gambled was there. And it was. Jameson Scott was climbing into the back of a white SUV when I spotted him. "Mr. Scott! Jameson Scott!" He glanced in my direction at the sound of his name, but then shut the door and rolled down the window as the SUV began to pull away. I threw a Hail Mary. "Your wards on that demon will never hold!" My voice echoed down the alleyway. The brake lights came on immediately, but no one exited the car. Taking it as an invitation, I ran up to his window. For a mere 25 years old, he sure looked like he'd seen some shit. His lined, pale, yet attractive face no longer carried a tired look, but a surprised one. I bent over to catch my breath. He didn't speak, but opened the door and scooted over. I climbed in.
Well, who may I have the pleasure?
Caitlin Ross. I held out a shaky hand. His surprise seemed to turn to shock.
Caitlin Ross,
he said slowly, with a strange inflection of reverence. Yes, I said, exasperated. I'm Caitlin Ross. And your words? They're bullshit. He didn't even bother to ask how I'd known, which in turn bothered me. He simply tapped the seat in front of him and his driver let go of the brake.
Those wards have held for 6 years, Miss Ross. I assure you, they'll hold.
You have no idea what you're dealing with here.
Oh, I assure you, I do.
There was a hard yet sad edge to his voice that suggested personal tragedy. I wondered if I'd misjudged him after all.
My apartments are only a block away. Perhaps we should speak more in my study. This isn't a conversation for anyone to overhear.
I noted the finality in his voice and, nodding, sat back in my seat. As long as I got to say what I'd come to say, I didn't care where we went. We were let off at the corner where several men in his personal detail were already waiting. Scott escorted me into a private entrance and private elevator with only one button marked Penthouse. As soon as the elevator doors opened, one of his men ushered me into his cavernous study, and the door was shut behind me. For whatever reason, Jameson entered from a different door a few minutes later, followed by his head bodyguard, who'd been at the lecture. This one didn't like me one bit, barely concealing irritation when he saw me. He was older, clearly over 30, with dark blonde hair and a square jaw. Jameson sat down behind his desk while I continued to stand. He gestured to an empty seat in front of him, but I shook my head. He gave a suit-yourself shrug and turned to his bodyguard, whose eyes continued to bore angry holes through me as they did everything else he looked at. This was quickly becoming enemy territory.
Scotch for me, Bannock. Anything for you, Caitlin?
No thanks, I mumbled, as the guard, Bannock, raked his hair back from his forehead in exasperation. I assumed at Scott's familiar use of my first name. I'm no threat to your boss, buddy. If anything, he is a threat to everyone else. I returned his icy glare, never wavering until his lips grew into a thin line, and he curtly nodded to Jameson and left the room.
First,
Scott began,
I want to establish...
Do you have any idea what you're doing? I asked, suspending all platitudes. Jameson leaned back cautiously in his chair, giving me a casual, go on, gesture. Why would you bring that thing to a populated city? Why would you put it on display for all to see and touch? What sort of arrogance allows you to think that you could control it with a few poorly copied sigils? He had made no move during my short outburst other than to tent his fingers and stroke his jaw with his thumb.
Which question would you like me to answer first?
Just then, the one called Bannock opened the door with a little too much force and brought his great lord and master a scotch. He turned to stand beside Jameson's desk, which seemed a natural and familiar spot for him.
You may go, Eric,
Jameson clipped, without so much as looking at him. The guard didn't move, and I continued to stare daggers at him. We engaged in our own little personal, silent standoff. He, like the statue, had eyes only for me, and they were filled with rage and ice. "He can stay," I ground out, finally. Let him know that I'm not afraid of him. If he was grateful for my help, he didn't show it.
As you wish. Your question?
I slid my eyes reluctantly back to Jameson. "How did you get it?"
I bought it from the government.
The government had it?
The state of Pennsylvania. It appeared on government land in the middle of nowhere, according to the surveyor who found it. They shipped it off to PSU, who dated and appraised it, and then they put it up for auction.
They just sold it to the highest bidder?
Yes, and why not? It's just a piece of granite to them, and they needed the money. The state of Pennsylvania is suffering its own financial crisis. Though I suppose that's what happens when, in essence, 20% of the state just stops paying their taxes. It's a curious thing.
I winced. He didn't need to elaborate. "Why did you buy it?"
Because I have personal history with Metaraxes. He has taken from me.
He's taken from me too, but I'm not parading him around in public, risking people's lives, their souls, according to you.
If you listened to my lecture, you would know why I do that.
I remained silent. Jameson sighed and leaned forward.
You're right, Caitlin. The wards won't hold him, not forever, and we don't know what will. The only reason they're holding now is because I'm giving him what he wants.
You assume that being exhibited in a museum satisfies the creature's desire for worship, and you're willing to stake people's lives on that?
I am. That creature has not moved a millimeter since he came into my care. I've employed teams of symbologists and demonologists to research, test, and advise me on the safest course of action. And for our efforts, the statue has remained dormant.
Yes, but it's not dead. You're gonna kill someone someday. Jameson sprung up from his desk and was in front of me before I'd even had a chance to take a step back. His bodyguard took an almost involuntary step toward him, but it was too late. Jameson was only inches from me and much more intimidating at eye level. Bannock seemed uneasy and ready to pounce if I tried anything. I didn't.
What would you have me do, Caitlin? Would you like to take custody of it? What would you do with it? Tell me, and I'll consider it.
Destroy it! He gave a sad, desperate bark of laughter.
Ha! Don't you think I tried that? Don't you think the first thing I did when I acquired it was try to kill it? I tried to incinerate it, hit it with a wrecking ball. I even ran it over with a tank. No, it won't be destroyed by any tools of man. And believe me, Caitlin, I paid dearly for my attempts. Almost everything I love is gone.
Then I'd put it back where it came from. If the church was even still there, and if I could find it.
No one can do that.
Who did it kill? Who that you loved? I don't know why I cared so much, but I couldn't let it go. I had to know. Scott took a step back, but he held his ground.
He
trailed off. And just how did you escape the creature when it came for you? This question hit him physically, like a bullet. He leaned back against the desk, suddenly weaker, defeated and less imposing. Bannock visibly relaxed, his hand sliding off the handle of the gun I hadn't noticed was still holstered in his belt.
That is another story for another time.
Fine. But I wasn't backing down. Then why you? Why are you the person who is qualified to own the statue?
Because I've seen its face. My fate is bound to it as surely as yours.
Jameson Scott rubbed his face in genuine exhaustion. If he hadn't been speaking the truth, then he was a damned good actor. He looked up at me finally, from hooded eyes that burned with some intense, unnamed emotion.
And who did it take from you?
Jamie. I had nothing to hide, and I wouldn't disrespect Jamie by hiding the truth. I raised my chin a little higher and crossed my arms. Scott's expression had turned milder, almost pensive, and a sad smile graced his handsome face. The tension in the room abated, though Bannock was looking at me intently, his expression unchanged since the moment he'd walked into the room. When Scott didn't reply, I decided it was now or never. I want to see it.
No,
he replied quietly. Alone.
No.
This time, both Jameson and Bannock had spoken at the same time. I'd known he wouldn't let me go. He'd never let me near the statue again. I'd assumed this before I'd even met him, which is why I'd swiped the museum keycard off his desk as soon as I'd had the opportunity. Why not? I asked him anyway.
Because he knows you.
And you know he could break the wards if he wanted to.
No, he could never get past the wards. They are perfectly drawn and blessed as they should be. But I won't risk your life.
Jameson Scott suddenly seemed battle-weary, so much older than his years.
Don't even try it, Caitlin. He will take you if you do. And the only one who will ever remember you is me.
His plea was multi-layered, intricately woven with threats of both deceit and familiarity. Once again, I was put ill at ease. There was only one more thing I wanted from this room. Who did it take from you, and how? Tell me that, and I'll leave Lannenberg in the morning and never come back. It was a lie, but I was curious. Jameson's eyes shifted to mine, perhaps to gauge if I meant what I said. He must have believed me because his gaze drifted to the window, and he answered my question.
I took her from myself.
It was an unsatisfying answer. Jameson stared at me as I took a step back from the desk. His eyes were again pregnant with an emotion I couldn't name, but it trod the line between longing and insanity. Perhaps desperate desire. Perhaps insane desperation. Perhaps something in between.
I will escort her out,
Bannock bit out as I made my escape out of the door. God, anyone but him.
No, I need you here. Andrews will see her out.
The door closed behind me, and I heard no more. Andrews turned out to be an older man with a bald head and a white beard. He met me at the elevator and escorted me all the way to the ground floor, saying little.
You need a ride somewhere?
He asked as we stepped out into the street. No, I can walk. He said no more. He just turned around and let the private door shut behind him. Nice of him to ask, at least. As I walked back to the museum, I had time to wonder just what in the hell I was doing. Why didn't I listen to Scott and just leave? What did I hope to gain by seeing that thing again? Couldn't I just trust that he seemed to have everything under control? Scott had the resources, the money, the people, and, most importantly, the motivation. He had lost someone too, after all. Someone he loved, though how that had come to pass was still not clear. But I knew I had to see it again. Perhaps I could prove to him just how dangerous that thing was, regardless of the precautions he was taking. I needed to convince him to take the statue off display before more people died. It was madness having it here. He was exposing innocent people to a demon on a reckless gamble. If I could make the statue move, just an inch or two, maybe even a turn of its head, it would be on the museum security tapes, and I could prove that the thing wasn't truly dormant. I read him as a pragmatic, reasonable man. He would remove the exhibit at once. I trusted that much. Didn't I? Once again, I pulled up Jameson Scott's Wikipedia page. All I knew was that he was a pioneer in the tech industry, rich as a Rothschild, and interested in 14th century Judeo-Christian artifacts. It didn't fit. It just didn't... Unless Jameson Scott was telling the truth. But even if he was being honest about his past, Scott was still lying to me about something. Like everything else in the past week, I would have to trust my gut. I arrived at the museum and walked around the giant building, looking for the gift shop. At that moment, I knew two things. The statue's room was next to the gift shop, and museums usually had nighttime security. I slid Jameson's card through the reader next to the door, and a light flashed green while the door emitted a soft click. I pushed it open and peered into the empty gift shop. Dim overhead lights gave the room an eerie and foreboding glow. The room reminded me of another room from over 10 years ago, a nave, darkened by dirty windows and a muted setting sun. I was younger then, more innocent, and I'd had Jamie then. What I wouldn't give to have him with me now. What would he say? Would he trust Scott? Would he attempt to stir the creature for the greater good? Or would he say I was stupid for risking my life? Jameson was convinced the wards would hold. Would Jamie have been too? Whatever happened, I hope I didn't fail him. I padded quietly through the dimly lit gift shop, pulling the straps of my backpack tighter over my shoulders like a security blanket. When I reached the opposite door, I leaned my head against it and tried to calm my rapidly beating heart. Taking several deep breaths, I slid Scott's keycard through the blinking card reader and was rewarded with a green flash and another soft click. The creature was right where I'd left it, as still as the statue it was pretending to be. I took my time wandering around the room, my eyes never leaving Jameson Scott's prize exhibit. If the demon was as satisfied and successfully warded as Scott bragged it was, then the creature either wouldn't notice or wouldn't care about my presence. I was starting to hope he was right. When I finally came around to face the statue, I approached it slowly and unbuckled the velvet rope with a shaky hand. I was so close to it now that all I could see when I looked up was the underside of its gigantic head. I suddenly wondered if years of schooling would help me read the words inscribed on the statue's stone platform. I bent down and started to pull up the velvet covering when I heard a quiet scrape above me, like stone on stone. It was a sound I'd heard before, in the soundtrack of my nightmares. So I had been right all along. The statue wasn't dormant. It was a hollow victory. I dropped the velvet and backed away from the statue, trying to determine what had moved. Nothing had changed to my naked eye, but I know what I heard. Bumping against the back wall, I decided to play a wild card. I needed it to move perceptibly if I wanted proof that the thing was still dangerous. I turned away from the demon and faced the wall, using an arm to brace myself. I couldn't believe I was doing this. I pushed my chips all in. "Do you really think I'm scared of you, after all these years?" I asked quietly, my voice echoing around the room like a gunshot. "You're just a piece of rock now, harmless to me." I held my breath and waited. Nothing. Feeling both disappointed and relieved, I sighed and turned around, dropping the keycard as well as my jaw. Though it hadn't made a sound, the statue was now not only facing me, but leaning out as far off its stone platform as it could. Its mouth was open and, almost imperceptibly, growing wider by the second. "You can't leave your platform," I breathed, as much to myself as the creature. My whole body was shaking and I was quietly backing up, slowly, to the door. I'd gotten what I'd come for. Now it was time to leave. It happened in the breath of a second. There was a sudden crack as the demon's tail whipped through the air behind it from one side to the other, as though it were not made of stone, but of flesh and blood. The glass encasing it on either side shattered. The makeshift wall behind split in two, and the velvet ropes came crashing down. One of the poles sent a sigil flying across the room. I screamed like I'd never screamed before as the creature's neck seemed to stretch across the room toward me, one of its wards no longer effective. I turned my back on it and ran for the door, realizing too late that the keycard now lay under the heap of rubble. I reached the double doors and tried to jerk them open, hoping they weren't locked from the other side. They were. The creature was once again still as stone. Everything but its eyes, which followed my every move hungrily. I beat on the door, yelling for security and wondering if I was doomed, and which thought would be my last. In my hysterical panic, I suddenly remembered how I had escaped this fate 13 years before. I stumbled back from the doors as much as I dared, and ran at them, shoulder first. They moved, creaked even, but ultimately laughed at my efforts. These were no rotten, decaying church doors. Crazed with fear, I backed up to try again, and this time, just as my shoulder reached the door, it opened from the other side, and I went spilling out on top of something hard. Or someone. He rolled over, and I passively registered that I'd landed on an enraged Bannock. He was standing and pulling me up by the strap of my backpack before the door even closed behind us. Bannock struggled to say something, trying several times, but was too angry for words. I didn't care. I threw my arms around him, just happy to be on the other side of the door. He didn't hug me back, just froze stiff and waited for me to get off of him. When I finally pulled back, I pulled my hood down and looked him full in the face. He wore a decidedly guarded look. Did you see what it did? I asked, pushing hair back from my face. That thing is not dormant at all. Tell your boss that, and that it needs to be moved. Tonight, if possible. In lieu of a response, Bannock grabbed my arm and headed toward the lobby. Since it was away from the exhibit room, I didn't care. He could take me to jail if he wanted, as long as Jameson Scott heard what happened here. I'd made my point to him and lived to tell the tale. Or had I? I suddenly wondered. Honestly, if I learned anything in that room, it had been that the creature hadn't forgotten me, the girl that got away. My life was a black mark on its record, an insult, and I had gone into its lair and challenged. What did I think was going to happen? Of one thing I was abruptly certain. It wouldn't stop until it had my life. The creature would burn through 100 cities, perhaps 1,000 to claim me. It had told me all of this somehow, hadn't it? I suddenly realized my mistake. The creature had been dormant when I'd arrived in Lanenburg, and it had been dormant 13 years before in Deepwood. And once again I had awoken it from a harmless slumber. How many would pay the price this time? How many people had to die before the end? Finally understanding the true cost of my arrogance, I let out a muffled cry and faltered, wondering with revulsion if perhaps I should just go back and face my fate. Wait! I coughed, trying to pry the guard's fingers from my arm. Bannock suddenly spun me around and pinned me against a wall, his arms braced on either side of my head. My eyes snapped up at him in shock, and I recoiled from what I saw there.
What the fuck are you doing here?
I was just...
Why did you come back, Katie? After all these fucking years?
My objection died in my throat. But it couldn't be. It wasn't possible. And yet, somehow it was. My legs gave out from under me, but Jamie caught me on the way down. He was older than he should have been, and stronger than I'd ever thought the skinny kid from Middlesbrough could be. But his eyes hadn't changed, and it was Jamie all the same. Even his expressions were familiar to me, I realized. What I first thought was seething anger was actually just barely controlled fear. Had the creature killed me after all? Was I swirling in the dark abyss with Jamie and all the others who had been taken? Jamie? My voice broke over his name.
Christ, Katie. You need to leave now and never come back. Hell, leave the country if you can. He'll never stop looking for you now.
I couldn't register what he was saying. Who wouldn't? Leave what country? Jamie, how was Jamie here? He kept me pinned there, his hold rigid, his eyes desperate and a little bit pissed off. Jamie! I tried again. How did you—
How did I know you'd come here? When has the word no ever kept you from something you wanted?
No, I mean, how—
We'll take her from here, Bannock.
A voice behind him interrupted me. Jamie slowly turned to face the three men, only one of which I recognized.
This one's been too much trouble. I want her gone.
Jamie returned with ice in his voice.
Mr. Scott says we are not to take orders from you anymore, Bannock. Give her here.
Jamie suddenly pushed me out of the way, and I went sliding across the floor. The wind knocked out of me. A rushing filled my ears as I tried desperately to catch my breath. When my hearing came back, Jamie was yelling at me.
Go!
I looked back to see two men down and Jamie struggling with the third. My sneakers struggled for purchase on the slick marble floor, and when they finally found it, I was up and running toward the lobby on the wings of adrenaline. I suddenly heard a sound like a book slamming onto a table. I spun around just as Jamie went down, clutching his shoulder. He fell on top of the man he'd been struggling with, who was now unconscious. Blood began to drip over his fingers, and I went sliding across the floor as I tried to stop to double back for him. Jamie started to say something, but passed out mid-sentence. His hand dropped from his shoulder, and the thin tendrils of blood began to race each other down his chest.
Well, now that is impressive.
Jameson Scott stepped forward from where he'd been leaning against the door.
And you know, I'm not impressed by much at my age.
I stumbled over to Jamie, but Scott stopped me with a single click of his gun. He walked over and rested a foot on Jamie's chest. I froze where I was.
I saw you take my key card, you know. You played the role perfectly. In fact, everything went according to plan. Except him.
Scott kicked Jamie in the ribs, but he didn't make a sound. What do you want?
Your name came up. I want you to die.
Why? Scott gave a pretentious scoff.
This isn't a James Bond movie, Miss Ross. I don't need to explain myself to you.
But you will, won't you? You want me to know how clever you are. I was playing with fire, but why not? We were far beyond caution now.
You're quite bright. There might have even been a place for you on my staff, if things had been different.
Don't flatter yourself. Why then? Why are you giving a demon what it wants? Didn't it kill someone you loved?
My daughter, actually. And why? It's my gift to a world I was born too late into. You know, I was 50 by the time the internet was invented. 50! What sad irony, then. That I was a technological genius. Oh, but the universe does love its sick jokes. Do you realize I've single-handedly guided the history of modern technology? It's true! But I reached my 70s and then my 80s. My vision began to fail. My hands would shake. I'd forget coding. I could barely manage to read at one point. I'd made millions, but I hadn't even started. I decided the world couldn't afford to lose me yet. So I tracked down every piece of ancient lore I could that may help me reclaim my youth. Most of it was rubbish, of course, but I was desperate. I'd almost given up. Until Metaraxes found me. I knew what he was as soon as I saw him. So I bought him, and warded him using the sigils I'd read about in ancient text. Of course, there was an expensive trial and error period. Many of my staff were killed in the process, but eventually we discovered the right sigils. The first thing I did was track down the man whose name was etched into the granite at Metaraxes' feet. I presented him for sacrifice, and I was rewarded. That was 6 years ago. I adopted a new name and started a new company. All was going well until your name came up about 4 years ago. You know, it really stumped me, because Metaraxes only desires those who are connected to him somehow. I didn't even know who you were, and you're far from the only Caitlin Ross in the world. I did try several others. Metaraxes would take them for certain, but The name never changed. Once again, I was getting desperate. So, you can imagine how happy I am that you showed up on my doorstep. God is telling me that he approves of my methods, and that I must stay alive for the good of humanity. My company is in the middle of revolutionizing surgical robotics, for Christ's sake. I will take a few lives to save 1,000,000.
Furious at his arrogance, I struggled to keep my voice level. Don't lie to yourself, Scott. You're no hero, just an old man afraid to die.
No, Caitlin. I'm just a man refusing to grow old. What can I say? I'm determined and resilient. I want to be young until the day I die.
That's not resilience, that's vanity. Vanity is what you're buying with my life.
There's always a price for social change, Miss Ross. And today, the cost is you. Oh, but you look upset. Don't be afraid of death, my dear. Not for such a worthy cause.
I'm not afraid of death, and I don't care about your diabolical plan. I just want you to get to the goddamn point. Jamie's breathing was growing shallow, and my voice dripped with animosity.
As you wish.
Scott nodded at something behind me. And then there was darkness. When I woke, I was lying on a cold marble floor, my brown mess of hair fanned out underneath me, stiff with dry blood and my wrists bound. I sat up slowly and tried to brush the hair out of my eyes. I knew where I was. There was no point in turning around to see it, but I did it anyway. It wasn't the fact that my name was engraved at the base of the statue that the velvet cloth had covered. It wasn't the wards, which had been moved from the demon's feet to the doors and walls of the room. It wasn't even the fact that the demon's head was turned as to be looking directly down at me. No, what terrified me most in that room was the man leaning against the wall, hands bound behind his back, as condemned to death as I was. The blood on his chest had dried, and he was awake, his eyes only partly open, watching me with an unreadable expression. "You look like shit, Jamie," I said matter-of-factly, as I pulled myself up to lean against the base of the statue, the only thing nearby.
"I've been busy."
His mouth curled up into a sarcastic smile. "I'm sorry I killed you. Again." I tried to smile back, if only to keep the tears at bay.
Nah, we'll survive this.
"I admire your optimism, but look around." I rested my elbows on my knees and sunk my head into my arms.
I lived through it once before, didn't I?
Yeah, about that? How?
About a week after you left, things started disappearing around town. People, buildings, even roads. No one remembered them but me. Then, one day, I woke up in an empty house. My dad and my brother were gone. So, I fled to the only place I knew was safe.
The damned church. Jamie shrugged.
I figured it was the one place the demon would never go. I don't know how long I lived there, but it felt like years. I slept at the church and traveled to nearby towns to steal what I needed to live. And then, one day, the towns were gone. All of them.
As he spoke, I watched him, memorizing every detail of his face. Even when I was nothing, I hoped something was left of me, a little piece that would remember him.
So I decided to find the thing. My dad was gone, my mom didn't remember me, and the only person who knew I lived was 1,000 miles away. So I went from town to town until I found it. It was just there, standing in the center of town. Nobody even thought it was weird. I was a pro at drawing sigils by then since I'd spent so much time at Deepwood,
and sigils have to be perfect to work, so I tried to ward it. It took a little while, but the statue always managed to break them. I'd find it a little further away from its base every night. People didn't seem to notice the statue had moved. What they did notice, however, was some kid loitering around their town. Since I looked older, and the town was getting wary of me anyway, I joined the local police force and spent my nights on patrol downtown, keeping an eye on the thing, reapplying sigils. Occasionally, I would wake up outside and I'd know my wards had finally failed. Then I'd have to track it to a new town and start all over.
Why didn't it just kill you?
I asked myself that until a few years ago, when your name came up. I think it needed me to find you. Ironically, in the end, it didn't need me at all. You came anyway.
I thought about that and wondered for the first time if I actually had come back to prove myself sane. Had I really intended to kill it? Or prove I'd been right? Or had it actually been about Jamie all along?
It took a long time, and a lot of towns. But I finally figured out what I was doing wrong. A sigil will slow it down, but in order to stop it, the ward needs to be blessed. And not just by anyone, by the second son of a Roman Catholic. Preferably from Assisi, Italy. Or at least near the region. Don't ask me how I figured that out.
So what happened to your second son from Assisi, Italy?
He disappeared.
Shit. I pushed my hair back again with my bound wrists.
Yeah, by that point I was a sheriff, and I'd been a city over. I came back to town to find my exit missing. The statue was gone. And that's when Jameson Scott got a hold of it.
And that's why you were protecting him?
You think I was protecting him? No. He was transparent about his intentions from the start. I applied to be on his detail, but was denied. No name, no experience. I only got on because I was able to take out all of his bodyguards in a sort of hand-to-hand combat trial. Guess all those trips through the police academy finally paid off.
Agreed. How does Jameson Scott know more about that statue than we do?
Because he had almost 80 people on his staff who did nothing but travel to every corner of the globe looking for any scrap of information on Metaraxis. We aren't the first ones to live to tell the tale. Just the first to stick around. I did all I could to keep people away from that thing. A name would be engraved on it one day, and a new name the next. It took me a long time to figure out what he was doing. And by then, your name had come up. He became obsessed with you, and I damned sure wasn't going to let him find you.
Well, that explains why you were mad when you saw me.
Mad? Katie, I've never been more terrified in my life. I spent years leading him down false paths only for you to present yourself like a lamb for slaughter.
I'm sorry, Jamie. I wasted all your fucking time. You spent 13 years trying to protect me, and I spent all that time trying to forget you.
Well, it's no less than I wanted for you. To forget about this place and me.
I heard the familiar stone-on-stone sound from above me. Is there any chance of reasoning with him? Your boss, I mean?
Not likely.
Jamie's voice was dark.
He fed his own daughter to that thing.
He what?
For the greater good, he said.
God, Jamie, I don't want to die. I don't want you to die.
You're not going to die here. Not today.
I ignored his optimism. Why do you think it hasn't killed us yet?
It's trying. Scott kept a close watch over his demon, but I managed to get one thing by him. That statue is sitting on a sigil the size of a Mini Cooper. It's not blessed, but it's big.
You're a brilliant bastard, Jamie Karras.
Well, I've sure had a lot of time.
I heard a clicking sound, and Jamie stood up, tossing a now worthless pair of handcuffs on the floor. He walked over and stood me up, using whatever tool he had picked his own cuffs with to free me. I heard them click, but when they fell to the floor, all I heard was the loud grinding of stone on stone again. It was louder and longer this time.
Don't look at it, Katie. Don't look up.
Jamie? I breathed, terrified. Suddenly, a face appeared behind Jamie. But this time, I wasn't hypnotized by it. Jamie saw the color drain from my face and grabbed me.
Follow me, now!
He yelled, pushing me in front of him to the gift shop door. I heard more movement from behind us and turned around while Jamie typed a long sequence of numbers into the card reader keypad. The creature had turned its head and was watching me. It was alive as it had ever been. The statue took a step off its platform, which shook the museum floor. Its movements were silent, yet fluid and flexible, like a cartoon on mute. Jamie?
Working on it.
Suddenly the keypad flashed green and the door clicked open. Jamie drew a black marker out of his pocket and drew a long line down the middle of the sigil, negating it. What are you doing?
Just trust me!
Jamie pushed me out the door. We slammed it behind us and tore across the gift shop to the exit. The door was locked. I turned around to tell Jamie as much, but he was already hurling a table through the window. It shattered just as I saw the door on the other side of the room begin to bend as it was pushed in from the other side. How did you unlock that door? I asked as we ran across the parking lot.
Scott isn't the only one who's good with programming,
Jamie yelled back. I followed him to the black Jeep sitting at the edge of the parking lot. We jumped in, just as a loud bang echoed across the asphalt. God only knew what it meant. Jamie shoved his keys in the ignition and turned the car over. We tore through the town like the devil himself was chasing us, which wasn't far from the truth. It was early, the first rays of sunlight streaming through the trees as we hit the highway. We hadn't gone more than 5 miles when a white SUV appeared behind us. It followed at a considerable distance. Why aren't they overtaking us?
Because this is what he wants. Scott knows where we're going.
Where are we going?
Deepwood.
Fuck, I said. I leaned back in the chair. But I trusted Jamie, so I didn't object. Won't it take the creature days to make it there? I asked, eyeing Jamie's speedometer, which was at 90.
It doesn't always move like that. It sometimes travels on another plane. I can't explain it. Everything changes and warps around that thing, even time. That's why I'm 8 years older than I should be.
He suddenly whipped off the road and headed for the tree line. The truck behind us did the same, and we maneuvered randomly through the trees, though I figured Jamie knew where we were going. I held on for dear life and watched him expertly navigate the almost hostile terrain or down trees and deep ditches. How far? I asked after 10 minutes.
6 miles, but you know how time is out here.
Did I ever? 4 minutes, yet somehow 6 miles later, we bumped over a set of railroad tracks and arrived at the damned church, which looked smaller and more impotent than it did in my nightmares. The front door opened easily this time, and I gave an involuntary shudder when I saw the Jesus statue, looking more judgmental now than ever before. The trap door was open. You lived here for years and you never closed the trap door?
Believe me, I tried.
Jamie grabbed my hand and guided me to the hole in the floor.
We have to go down there.
Fuck no! I snatched my hand away.
It's the only way this will end, Katie.
You've got to be kidding me, I muttered as I took the first reluctant step down. I suddenly stopped. Wait! You said it wouldn't ever come back here.
It would for you.
Jamie followed behind me and took the stairs down, one shaky step at a time, flashlight in hand. I didn't see it until right before we reached the bottom. The demon was already here, waiting for us. It stood in the same position we'd first found him in 13 years before, though this time its face was not stone. The demon's eyes swept across the room in a wide arc. His tail was wrapped around the bottom of the staircase. If he was already down here, why couldn't we stay up there? I whispered.
He wasn't.
There were no wards to protect us now, and nowhere to run. I couldn't help thinking this was a bad plan. Well, he's here now, so let's go.
We can't, Katie. If we leave now, he will too.
Well, then what's your plan, Jamie? Jamie said nothing, just stared at the demon, who was now staring back at him. Suddenly, I felt something like a tug in the pit of my stomach. I stepped back, and it happened again. I looked up into the creature's eyes, which had moved to mine. And suddenly I realized what was happening. There was another tug, harder this time, and I felt my mind, if not my body, being pulled toward the demon's head. A long black tongue jutted out to welcome me, and the creature's mouth began to widen. So, this was it. The nothingness. The demon's mouth was so wide I could have simply walked into it, if I had a body. The blackness started to close in on all sides, creating a sort of tunnel vision. And then, in a violent jolt, I was snapped back into my body, a perfect sigil drawn on my chest in black marker. The creature screamed, an ear-splitting sound, and Jamie flung me over his shoulder before I had even re-established my bearings. We were to the top of the staircase in under a minute, the demon still emitting a deafening wail.
I'm sorry! I was sure it would come from me first!
We burst into the nave, and Jamie, seeing our company before I did, pushed me across the altar toward the crucifixion, which I took out as I fell. I scrambled back, kicking it away from me as I did. By the time I looked up, Jameson Scott was standing in front of the trap door, a gun to Jamie's head. His men hung back, but looked eager to get involved at a word from their boss.
Get back down there, Miss Ross.
Fuck you! My last word was drowned out by a loud cracking sound that echoed through the little church as the spiral staircase came crashing down below.
Katie, don't— Ah!
Jamie caught a knee to the ribs, some of which I was pretty sure were already broken. I scrambled back further. There's no staircase now. There's no way to get down there.
Oh, yes, there is.
Scott sneered.
You're going to die either way. At least this way you'll save his life. Metaraxes is trapped down there for the time being, so it's to the cellar you must go. Perhaps you shouldn't have injured him by breaking his bond mid-feed.
Katie!
Jamie growled.
Don't be fucking stupid. Just run!
Fuck no, Jamie! I didn't leave you in this place then, and I won't now! It was time to pay my dues. I stood up and walked to the edge of the trapdoor. Perhaps, if fate was kind, I would die when I hit the floor 30 feet below. I looked up at Jamie, intending my last words to be for him. I knew the moment he realized that intent. Jamie jerked his body forward and threw himself and Scott into the dark hole between us. No! I screamed as Scott's men scattered at the door. I skidded over to the side of the hole, tripping over the smaller statue on the way.
I'm here!
Came a pained groan from Jamie, who was just barely clutching onto the side. Thanking every deity I knew of, I pulled him out of the hole and back into the nave. His wound was bleeding fresh blood, and I knew we didn't have much time. I laid him on his back as he started to slip into unconsciousness, applying pressure to his shoulder. A moan came from the trapdoor beside us.
Help me. Please. Please. I'm hurt.
So Scott had survived the fall. I grimaced and pulled myself over to the edge to peer into the darkness below. I could see nothing, but the creature was no longer screaming. My blood began to boil as I let Jameson Scott wail away his swan song.
Please. It's staring at me. I can feel it. Please. Name your price, I'll pay it. Just save me.
Oh, now, why would I do that, Mr. Scott? This is what you wanted, after all. You get to be young until the day you die.
Suddenly the trapdoor slammed shut, Jamie standing over it, as the entire building began to shake. The edges around the door grew bright, like molten metal, before darkening like a blown-out flame.
Will it hold?
I yelled to Jamie over the increasingly loud earthquake.
Is it blessed?
Some say by God himself.
I'd say that counts, I said to myself as I tried to stand up on the violently shaking floor. Jamie hoisted me up next to him and ran for the door as the bits of ceiling began to cave in. The door to the church swung open of its own volition before we got there and slammed shut behind us. The church came down in a butt of dust and splintered wood. When all had settled, Jamie was barely conscious. I walked him to the car and pushed him into the passenger seat. He was out before I'd shut the door. I took one last look at the pile of rubble before climbing into the driver's seat and starting the car. I followed the same train tracks home that got us out of Deepwood when we were kids. I made it to the road without ever looking back. I can tell you exactly how long Jameson Scott lived. 4 days. By the dawn of that 4th day, he and all of his inventions abruptly disappeared from the world. There were a few that I was sad to see go, like the rise of inductive charging and eyeglass. You would have loved eyeglass, and you probably did, honestly. Contact lenses that were actually cameras. They put GoPro out of business. I could never afford it, but you may have had one. I miss those YouTube videos. Jamie spent a month recovering from his gunshot wound. After he was released from the hospital, we spent a few weeks weighing our options. In the end, we decided to hunt down people like Jameson Scott and the powers they wielded. You don't know about them, and if we have our way, you never will. Due to Jamie's time with Scott, we have some good leads. We have a lot of blood on our hands to atone for, and a lifetime to do it in. Deepwood is dead. Only Jamie and I even know where it is, so the town dies with us. I wouldn't try to find it if I were you. I've changed a lot of details, names of towns, names of roads, perhaps even when this all happened. I won't tell you, and you don't want to know anyway. Somewhere, out in a 100-mile sea of trees and dirt, lies the demon's door. It's still there, under a pile of rotting detritus that used to be a small church. The door may be found again someday. It may even be opened. But one thing is for damn sure. It sure as hell won't be because of me.